Excellent, as always. Okay, so our next paper is by Abigail Lewis. She is a PhD candidate in European history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and currently a fellow at the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum, at the U.S. Memorial Museum. She will be completing her dissertation in 2019, that's the plan, entitled The Collaborationist Eye, The History and Memory of French Photography Under the Nazis. So today her talk will be The Secrets of Film, Rethinking Occupation Through Visual Archives. Okay.
Okay, let me just open this up real quick. It should all just come right up? All right.
Flip up.
All right.
That's the theory.
It is locked. Or never mind, it's unlocked. There we go.
It should be minimized.
Okay. And from current slide. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and Sandy for having me. And so this is a story I've told a couple of times now, so I apologize if you've heard it before, but it's one that's really shaped my methodology. And so this, for me, is my story of trying to find a photographer in the archives and trying to find photographs. All right. And one note, there's a slight change in the title, so I've changed the challenges and possibilities of the visual archive. Okay. So today's paper would perhaps be better titled The Well-Kept Secret of Photographs. My research on photography during the occupation has left me with multitudes of unanswered, perhaps even unanswerable questions. The biggest problem I've encountered is the sheer mass of photographs present in the archives as material prints, glass plates, original film, and increasingly digitized, and an absence of robust archival sources that can directly explain a given image. However, when read both against archival sources and with attention to a photograph's status as a durable material object, scholars can begin to contextualize photographs in ways that allow us to access the past. In this paper, I'm going to reflect on the methodological challenges in using photographs as historical sources to understand collaboration and French collective memory, and the ways that I navigate these issues to incorporate material photographs into what will be a larger history of collaborationist photography. My historical interest in photography in part stemmed from my frustration regarding the appearance of photographs as largely illustrative devices in history, and not the products of political, social, or cultural structures from which they emerged, but also re-emerged. And so I was reading many books, and I'd see these amazing photographs, and I would just want to know more about them. I'd want a book to actually think about how that's part of the history rather than just showing that it exists. And a handful of historians have taken seriously the contribution that photographs as material objects, as well as photographers as historical actors, have made to historical events. And they have shown that documentarians, observers, photographers reinforce racial, gendered, colonial, and cultural power structures. And this seemed particularly clear to me when flipping through the many photo books about World War II and the occupation. And as anyone who studied World War II, I mean, some of the best sources that we have are these insane photo books that have been published and collected, and photo albums, but it hasn't been well kind of theorized what we can do with them. And so for me, photographers were not objective observers removed from the scenes they documented, and moreover, the scenes depicted in the photographs, to me at least, said something about social interactions and ideological control. For example, many photographs of the occupation depict Nazi soldiers up close, and for me, this suggests that the photographer was welcome to take the shot. So by simply displaying images as windows into the past, such work disengages with the photograph's very historicity, rooted in the politics of the occupation, the agency of the photographers, and the circulation, preservation, and display of these images. Photographs could do more than narrate the war. They were capable of revealing larger complexities regarding the politics and experiences of the occupation. So in search of a dissertation topic, I stumbled upon the 2008 Andrzej Zuka exhibit, Les Parisiens sur l'Occupation, at the Bibliothèque Historique de la Ville de Paris. And really, it was more that my advisor showed me the photo book, and then I became very, very interested in the topic. I think she'd be surprised that I'm still working on this. The exhibit featured 270 of Zuka's color photographs of life in occupied France. And what struck a nerve with an international cast of visitors was not just Zuka's collaboration with the Nazi magazine Signal, and this is what makes the photographs possible. Visitors were infuriated with what the photographs showed, and that's Parisians leisurely living in Paris just like any other year. And I'll show you some of these photos. Here's one of them here. And so the photographs seem to accuse the French of complicity. They showed Parisians swimming in the Seine on a gorgeous summer afternoon in 1942. And this is the same summer, right, where you have 13,000 Jews that are rounded up in Paris. So the accusation then is that for some, that living under the occupation, which is, the dark years, is maybe not so dark. And so here are just kind of a handful of some of the images that have been digitized for me from the exhibit. So there's a real sense of normalcy, right? I think this one's interesting because this is also part of the exhibit, but it also really shows the way that Zucca is focusing on bodies and focusing oftentimes on women and sexuality, which I'll talk about a bit in a minute. And this is the photo that I mentioned of the Seine. And I think this one is so interesting because when I was living in Paris in 2016, I think, for April Fool's, Anne Hidalgo said that the Seine would be swimmable in the next year or so, which is always just a running joke, but to actually have this image for me was really interesting. So what struck me was the mysterious story of Zucca's collaboration and the complexity of the photographs. I questioned what it meant to work as a photographer under occupation. To what extent and in what ways did French photographers collaborate? How did photographs assert but also challenge the Nazi state and ideology? And as the exhibit laid bare, in what ways have such collaborationist images provoked French memories of the war in unexpected ways? Looking at the photos, I believe there was an untold story, a well-kept secret behind their scenes. And something that's important to note is that these photographs were not published in Signal. These are coming from his personal private archive. So that's a different level of complexity that's added to them. So at first I tried to answer these questions visually. I leaned on visual theorists such as Ariella Azoulay, Jane Collins, Catherine Lutz, and Barbie Zelitzer, among many others, to try and work through Zucca's aesthetics, to try and unearth their hidden stories and their connection to Nazism. In the civil contract of photography, Azoulay sees the camera as a mechanism of power that explicitly records encounters between the photographer and pictured subject, as well as implicitly documents a viewer's encounter with the scene. These encounters are embedded within power structures that then render the photograph and its display possible. However, Azoulay goes even further to give the camera a sliver of agency, capable of recording the unintended. She writes, "But just as the photographer's position cannot be removed from the photograph, neither can the photographer totally remove another viewpoint. Photographers, despite their skill and professionalism, despite technical aids such as Polaroid cameras or digital screens, are unable to lock the frame around their viewpoint. The photograph will always include something that is not reducible to the photographer's viewpoint." So for me, Azoulay's work opened up some interesting and challenging interpretive possibilities for examining photographs under occupation. What if these photographs could tell us something that went beyond the photographer's intention? What if photographs could reveal something deeper regarding the realities of the occupation, structures of power, and individual experience? And if so, how could we access these stories within the photograph? So over the course of a year and a half in Paris, and this feels like nothing compared to Sandy's 43 years in Pau, but I unearthed a cache of photographs from the war years, some carefully tucked in archival dossiers, amassed in barely cataloged boxes, conserved on their original glass plates, visible only with the technical aid of a table lumineuse. I was overwhelmed with the sheer mass of photographs I found, and I haven't really been able to well quantify, but it's at least 50,000. And that's against a paucity of sources that actually allowed me to contextualize them. And this is one challenge with photographic evidence. There are simply too many photos, each with an individual story, and not enough archival documents to accompany them. So at first I cast my net broadly, examining fashion magazines, police photographs, ID cards, military images, propaganda pamphlets, and newspapers. I ordered any boxes related to photographic propaganda in Vichy or in occupied France, and any boxes with a mention of having photographs at all, and anything related to Zucca. So at one point an archivist actually told me I was crazy when I tried to order, put in a délégation for 200 boxes of photographs. And I found that the occupation had been a visual experience. Photographs had appeared everywhere in both zones of France, on posters, in newspapers and magazines. They hung on the walls of propaganda offices. They were sent to Germany and to the Allied press. They were bought and sold by propagandists. Therefore, there was a good reason why there are so many photographs of the occupation, and why Vichy left such a trenchant visual record of its short existence. So in France, the Nazis recognized that photography presented a method of political control, that propaganda in many respects meant directing what could be seen and what could be documented. In September of 1940, the Nazis banned all outdoor photography in the occupied zone, and this is actually an extension of earlier policies that the French had implemented at the beginnings of World War II, but wasn't a total ban at that point. So in effectively controlling what could be seen and securing that only certain individuals could document, photography became a weapon of political dominance and ideological control. During the fall of 1940, the Nazis gradually added new faces to the list of approved photographers, French collaborators. In exchange for help in distributing Nazi propaganda from Berlin and their willingness to provide photos of the occupation in return, the propaganda Abteilung authorized French photographers to reopen their businesses and to acquire the precious materials they needed to photograph. These photographers gained press passes and at times an Ausweis, allowing for their movement across zones to cover the events of the occupation. And critically, they were allowed to publish their photographs in newspapers and magazines in France. And in late 1941, the Vichy presidency is going to move to centralized photographic propaganda, and this is going to be behind the Service Central Photographique. Their goal was twofold: to grasp control over the work of photographers and to revolutionize their photography. Vichy was getting beat by Germany's good quality photographs that depicted their subservience to the Third Reich. Vichy tried to fight back by taking control of their representation and enhancing the quality of their photographs. So Vichy has its own photographic history, which is also quite interesting. So where did Zucca's story fit within this history? I tracked down Zucca in two critical archival collections. I found scant mention of him within the propaganda archives or the files of the professional organizations that had otherwise proven fruitful to my research. So after months of research, Zucca and his Parisienne, for me, were still an enigma. At the Archives Nationales, I found 3 microfilmed reels of Zucca's personal archive of photographs. So these are photographs that the Archives Nationales is going to acquire through his family. And I'll start. I apologize, these photos are very bad quality, but they are all microfilms. And each sheet has, I think, 6. It's 6 by 6 for each sheet on the microfilm. So this collection primarily consisted of tiny clips of his photographs, but the files also contained captions, stories, archival documents collected with the images. I had finally found a glimpse of Zucca's voice, both through his description of the photos and through his larger body of work. And this is going to span from the 1930s to the 1960s. So these photos are going to be unbounded by the occupation years, which for me is really important. Seen over a larger span of time, Zucca's photographic archive was not at all that different from his focus in Les Parisiens. The archive was rich with photographs of dancers, sometimes dancing nude for his camera, acrobats, athletes, pedestrians basking in the park on a Sunday afternoon. There were family photographs, including Zucca and his wife, lounging on the beach during a family vacation. And emotion radiates out of his pictures. Zucca especially recorded the smiles of his subjects. So looking at his larger body of work, it at least suggests that his framing of the Parisienne was not a new aesthetic at the time, and that it was consistent with his focus throughout his career. However, this archive also demonstrated that Zucca employed a similar focus on affect, embodiment, and cultural life when photographing the occupation. Just as the exhibit had shown, Zucca recorded the smiles of the milice, the volunteer French soldiers departing for Germany, the SS, and even the propaganda Abteilung workers. And let me just show you some of these. So this is one image that I found of Zucca that he took of himself, and this here is his wife. And the bottom one is also of Zucca. So these are some of the family photos that are in there. The top 2 are one of the officials for the propaganda Abteilung. And I like this one here. You can't see it that well, but he's just smiling. And then these ones are of French soldiers after liberation. So you also see that he's continuing to work after the end of the war. These are some of the ones that I mentioned of the dancers. I think this one here is from 1938, but he continues to take these kinds of photographs throughout the war as well. Here's a woman who worked for, who is a secretary for propaganda. Also, he's always focusing on people's smiles, which I found really kind of interesting and intriguing. But then you see something like this, where he's photographed this train. These are the volunteer soldiers going to Germany that says Mort aux Juifs. So also he's not escaping the politics of the occupation, and actually he's willing to take these kinds of photographs. He has many photos that he's taken of Pétain. He even visits Pétain's the farm where he'd grown up and writes this perspective article about the future. Well, partially it's about Vichy, but then it juxtaposed that with the farm that he grew up in. So this immense collection is going to demonstrate that Zucca did not at all shy away from the politics of the occupation, and that he has no problem not only taking images that are anti-Semitic, but also humanizing Nazi agents and collaborators. So these photographs do not allow us to easily rule on the meaning of Zucca's collaboration or his politics. What they do give us is a glimpse of Zucca's artistic viewpoint and his experiences. This private collection containing family portraits, Parisian spaces, and ballerinas, alongside politically incendiary photographs of SS soldiers, the LVF, and here expression of anti-Semitism, complicates any quick evaluation of either his zealous collaboration or, as I'll mention in a moment, his resistance. And the archive provides a more complicated story of his experiences as photographer and artist. Now, Zucca's story will also appear in the post-war records of the Court of Justice. Here, his photographs showed up with context. They actually serve as legal evidence against him. And we'll start to show some of those. And so in 1944, Zucca was investigated, arrested, and ultimately charged with collaboration. And it's going to be specifically for his work with Signal. But surprisingly, the case never goes beyond basically the pre-trial hearings. They actually dropped the case in the middle of it. And so I became really interested in why that might be. So the files don't actually really tell us why it wasn't pursued, but we do have several resistors testify on Zucca's behalf that he provided photographs to the Allies. There's also evidence, at least from these resistors, that he may have was smuggling photographs far before he was ever associated with Signal. But then he also has correspondence that showed that he had little choice in what he was doing, that he was pushing back against the propaganda Abteilung, and that they're actually quite unhappy with his kind of focus on culture and daily life. But then one interesting story that emerged for me was one of these resistors kind of reinterprets these photographs. And so regarding the aesthetics of Zucca's image, one defense witness offered a counter reading of Zucca's focus on French culture and leisure. This witness pursued that Zucca's images were, quote, sentimental photographs of our Paris, quote, end quote, invaded by the Germans. He described how the photographs caught the Germans in beloved spaces, like theaters, parks, and monuments, and how the soldiers' presence represented a searing disruption to daily life, not a harmonious addition. He saw Zucca's aesthetic choices as mirroring his defiance of the Germans and his emphasis on positive images of France. At least from this one perspective, the photographs were not guilty of aestheticizing and normalizing the occupation. Instead, the images represented his love for his city. And critically, this is one of the few cases I've found where the defense doesn't actually present any photographs, but there's lots of photographs that are presented by the prosecution, and these are all clipped from Signal. So seemingly they're the best kind of evidence, because it proves that he was actually publishing these images. So here are a few examples of that. So we have Montmartre sous les bombes, and this is a photo that came then from that article of Rochechouart. This one I like, it says Rien de nouveau à Cavaillon, and it's all about how kind of seemingly nothing has changed in this small town called Cavaillon, and you have lots of images of people going about their daily lives. Here's the Départ de Versailles, so you have these young boys who are very excited, right, to go off to Germany. Here they are waving from the train. And then I'll come back to this one in a moment. So Zucca may not have lost his legal battle, but in the court of public opinion, he was guilty. Following the conclusion of the case, Zucca left his home in Paris and moved to his property in Dreux, which he had, of course, bought during the occupation, which is, again, another kind of complicated layer to this. And he opened a small photography studio specializing in wedding photography. For Zucca, a previous renowned photojournalist, becoming a wedding photographer must have felt like its own scarlet letter of shame. This idea is echoed in the fact that Zucca changed his last name to Pierre Niec, which is a combination of his children, Pierre and Nicole. And then up until about the 1960s, Zucca is going to continue to photograph daily life in Dreux, and this is going to include, in the 40s, the presence of American troops in the city, the return of deportees, and community events in the village. While still woefully incomplete, tracking Zuka's story required reading archival documents and images against each other, as they appeared in his personal archive, the pages of Signal, the courtroom, and the VHVP exhibition. In so doing, I located 3 but not contradictory versions of Zuka in his photographic work that allowed me to make some broad conclusions regarding photography and collaboration. We see Zuka as a zealous collaborator, photographing only for the interests of Nazi propaganda. We see Zuka as a resistor, pushing back against Nazi demands and smuggling his images abroad. And last, we see a more complicated image of him, one that is not reducible to either of the above pictures, but also hard to understand politically. What did it mean to photograph a French women smiling during the war in the same way as the Nazi soldiers? What did it tell us about him that he extensively documented the culture and politics of the Vichy regime? It is too simplistic a reading of Zuka's photography to see him or his photographs in one way. Attempting to define Zuka's experiences and those of many of his colleagues in these terms risks losing much of the nuance that made their stories as photographers particular. Furthermore, the Zuka story underscores that photographs gain meaning through their various contexts. And at least in this story, it includes the conditions that are driving him to record and the way the image is viewed over time. So if we're seeing them in Signal versus in the VHVP exhibit versus in the personal archive. And Zuka's images gain different veneers through their places in these different forums. So the tensions between the 1945 case and the 2008 affair, one ending in the possibility for resistance, which we're of course skeptical of, and the other in a complete condemnation of his collaboration, reflect the continuous inflection of the meaning of these images. So my dissertation is peppered with very similar complex stories of photographers whose photographs I have similarly matched with documents and archives that can allow me to think through the possibilities of these images. But what was unique about the Zuka case was its strong connection to contemporary collective memory. Although his case appeared more complicated, at least from the legal standpoint in 1945, and by 2008, the response to the Zuka photographs highlighted a return to black and white notions of collaboration and resistance. As viewers gazed at the brightly color-enhanced photographs, the story they told did not exactly match up with French cultural memories of the dark years. As the photographs showed French bodies jumping in and lounging around the bright blue waters of the Seine, a scene seemingly out of fantasy, they brought color to the occupation in unsettling and viscerally upsetting ways. Rather than engage with the narratives the photo could tell, the responses to the photographs circled back to reified ideas of collaboration. The photographs had to be propaganda, straight from the mind of a Nazi supporter. The alternative, the photographic subjects, these Parisiens, must have been complicit. Now, one idea I'm kind of working through that I just want to throw out there that I have not, haven't quite figured out, is then how these photographs become kind of detached from his collaboration, when we can view them then as conveying ideas about history. And so 2 of his images that are very iconic and that we see, I mean, I've located this image on numerous scholarly book covers in museums. Most people would recognize it, as well as this photograph. I mean, the Holocaust Museum uses this to talk about persecution in France. And so this to me is then another way that we're viewing these images, and I have this kind of final unanswerable question that I haven't quite figured out, which is, at what point, when do images get to stand for history, and then when do we allow them to kind of bear the weight of their history? And this is something this is for me a very unanswerable question, but something that I'm very interested in kind of thinking more about. Right? Thank you.